Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me. Make sure to follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends. I got a great guest coming on because there's a lot of misinformed people out there when it comes to the idea of capitalism. And a lot of people tend to believe that America is a capitalist country, but we haven't been a pure capitalist country for decades. I could argue for a century. In any event, the guest I have is Richard Salsman. He's been on the program before. He wrote a great book, Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? I encourage everyone to read it. I have links up at the PAS report. Richard, welcome to the program. How are you today?
Very good. Thanks for having me back. Great to be back, Nick.
Well, it's always interesting to talk to you. So I want to start off because when we look at the economy today, you know, a lot of people don't understand what's really going on. Obviously, you have President Trump putting tariffs on. Sometimes they're on again, then they're off again. And the market certainly doesn't like the uncertainty. But I know that you're not a fan of tariffs. You despise tariffs, as most free market capitalists do. What's your thoughts? How are the tariffs going to impact the overall economy? And are we going to witness doom and gloom, or do you think the dynamics have changed since the 1920s and 1930s?
Well, you mentioned the 1930s, which is a good parallel because the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930, passed under Hoover, was enormously detrimental to trade. I think international trade generally fell by 2/3 and contributed enormously to the Great Depression. So historical examples of this are important. That's an example of protectionism, very severe protectionism. But then on the positive side, especially like post-World War II, there have been episodes of freer trade, not completely free like you and I would want it, but the direction's important. Are we going toward freer trade or less free trade? And those have been very bullish for economic growth, prosperity, and including manufacturing jobs. So one of the main myths out there now is that the American manufacturing base is eroding because we've had years and years of free trade, especially since the Reagan years. That's not true. There's other reasons why manufacturing has been declining in the U.S., but it's not manufacturing output, it's manufacturing jobs. If you output the same amount with fewer jobs, that's actually a productivity gain. We should want cases where there's productivity gains. Now, here's the thing I'd say about tariffs. Tariffs was the first revenue source for the federal government after the founding, 1790 or so, because there was no income tax, corporate income tax, estate tax, sales. There was no other taxes but that. So first of all, tariffs are taxes, first of all. Second, I'm not actually against low rate uniform tariffs. Those are generally what Hamilton and Washington advocated. Jefferson and Madison less so. They wanted what they called discriminatory tariffs. In other words, discriminate against Britain, say, and favor France. So we do have that under protectionism. Another example would be favor some industries or products versus others. You know, put tariffs, in other words, say on steel or something else to help out the steel industry. I'm against those kind of things. But if you have low rate, now by low rate, I mean like less than 5%, less than 10%. If they just came out and said, listen, we're going to gradually raise tariff rates from, it was 3% last year, I don't know, to 5 and then 10 uniformly across the board to raise revenues. You know what I mean? Not to impede trade, which is really what they're saying. They want to stop imports and they want to, bolster, they think, manufacturing or punish certain countries. So notice the reasons being given are not really revenue raising. And so that's the key point. You don't want them high, arbitrary, and discriminatory, meaning differentials between countries and products. That is definitely what Trump is doing, though. And as you said, one of the big parts of this is the arbitrariness of it. You could, I know you're a constitutionalist, so am I. You could argue this from the standpoint of the president should not be unilaterally raising taxes. I mean, that's in the Constitution as a power of Congress. And it's interesting that they gave the president power to do this, actually. Congress did. This is so odd. It's similar to the regulatory state. They gave the executive branch the power to more unilaterally change tariffs. Guess why? Because of the Smoot-Hawley Act. The Smoot-Hawley Act was actually passed by Congress, and so many of them got in on it and made that thing worse and worse that after the war, with the free trade, actually in 1934, they reversed direction and said, to keep this out of politics, let's hand it to the president. And they counted on the president being a free trader, that he would lower tariff rates. And that was largely true up until Kennedy, at least, and then Reagan. But now you have a president who has this unilateral power, and he's a tax raiser, not a tax cutter. The last thing I'll say, I don't want to monologue too much here. The last thing I want to say is Trump is saying that foreigners pay tariffs. That's the most amazing thing to me, that people from both sides of the aisle kind of let him get away with that. Tariffs are paid by the importing country. And there's some shifting, if you will. Exporters abroad will try to keep their sales up, say by absorbing some of the but these tariffs are paid by American importers, either household or people like Walmart. They're the one who pays the taxes. So when Trump says China will pay the tax or Chile will pay the tax, that's just not true. He is raising taxes on Americans, and all else equal, raising taxes, especially at high rates. And I think he's quintupling them roughly. I think at the end of the day, this will come out as tariffs in general going from 3 to 5% to 15 to 20%. So that's a big increase.
Well, I'll tell you right now, I'll be all for tariffs if you want to eliminate the income tax. Then I'll be all in on them. But when we look at it, since Smoot-Hawley, has the dynamics changed? I mean, America is now the largest consumer. And following the Cold War, what we saw was a lot of these lopsided trade deals with countries because we gave them favorable terms because we wanted them to be part of our alliance. We wanted them to support the United States and not move towards the Soviet sphere of influence.
Right.
Do you think that this is a result of the last several presidents failing to correct the imbalances within trade that have existed for the last couple of decades?
No, I don't think so. I think the trend, at least since the end of World War II, when they instituted GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that was 1946 or so. And then the World Trade Organization in 2001, I know a lot of pro-American, America First, who I am, America First, people think that was a sellout. I believe that was a continuation of GATT and an attempt to have as much free trade worldwide as possible. Now, here's the thing, I think, Nick, the imbalances you're talking about, I think are not inherently negative. In other words, if by imbalances we mean Americans are importing more goods and services than they're exporting, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I completely agree with that. I mean, obviously, we're a big country, we're a consumer-driven economy, and we export a lot of services, maybe not products, but services to other countries.
Right.
But what I'm talking about is when countries say, you know what, we're not going to take American cars, or we're going to slap high tariffs on it because we got to keep our industries alive, which I understand to a certain degree. But at the same time, we have to look out for the United States.
I agree. I think in those cases where you say, we only have, suppose, 10% tariffs on Japanese cars, but Japan has, I'm guessing here, just as an example, suppose they say they have 50% on our cars. It's still them taxing their own citizens. So the Japanese government is penalizing Japanese citizens. Now, we can say it's harder for us to export, but I have never found a case where by us raising tariffs, we get others to lower their tariffs. The only way to do this, I think, is go to a more neutral arbiter like the World Trade Organization, or just have bilateral agreements where you try to convince them to lower their tariff rates. But with the way Trump is doing it is similar to the way Hoover did it, namely unilaterally raising rates. They use the word reciprocal. I think I know why they're doing that, because it sounds more like they're going to get lower tariffs abroad, but that's not really happening. I want to go back also to an earlier point. This is somewhat technical, but I know you know this. Maybe your audience doesn't. If the U.S. imports more goods and services than it exports, which is what a trade deficit is, it has to mean that we're paying foreigners and the money goes out the door. So when you think about it, dollars are going out, say cars and electronics are coming in. So in a way, we're exporting our money. We're exporting dollars, right? And what do they do with those dollars? They don't use dollars. They use their local currency, right? So they will take this and buy. Guess what they buy? They buy, I mean, you mentioned services. Yes, we have a surplus in services, but they also massively buy stocks and bonds and real estate titles. Now, this alone, as you know, bothers people because if they say, "Oh my gosh, the Japanese," remember in the 80s, they said Japan owns the Rockefeller Center, or BMW has plants in South Carolina. I think as long as we're not being xenophobic about these things, it should be okay for foreigners to invest in the U.S. And that's definitely the flip side.
Agreed, except for China and farmland.
Right. But that's the flip side of importing more goods than you export. We're exporting more titles, if you will, and they're sending us investment capital, which is a good thing. In countries where they're losing capital, it's called capital flight. It's a very bad thing. Latin America has suffered this for years. So it's a bit technical, but that's why they call it the trade balance. At the end of the day, the reason there's a balance of payments is it's not like there's an unsustainable, ripoff going on. As Trump literally thinks if you import more than you export, there's a ripoff. But people are importing these things for a reason. They're not being arm twisted into importing things. The things that are imported and seen on the shelves of Walmart and elsewhere, people want these things and they either can't get them locally or can't get them as cheaply locally. So I'm all for free trade. I have the most extreme view, I think, but it has been defended in the history of economic thought, which is called unilateral free trade. Bilateral is just two countries. Imagine the US and Mexico getting together. Multilateral, means there's maybe 12, 15 countries in the room. The more people in the room, the harder it is to get a deal. I mean, it could take forever. And now unilateral takes no negotiation. Unilateral means you adopt low barriers and low tariffs, even if, here's the weird thing, even if other countries don't. I think that's actually the ideal situation. And I think if it played out that way, other countries would eventually be motivated to lower theirs as well. But there'd be no arm twisting. There'd be no long-term negotiation necessary. So that's a more extreme. Even free traders will say you have to negotiate this bilaterally or multilaterally or through the WTO. But the actual free market answer to this is no, do it yourself unilaterally. In other words, adopt free trade. Trump, in a way, is on the complete opposite because he's unilateral, but raising tariffs.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting thing that he's doing. It's going to be interesting to see how the economy plays out, but we need to take a quick break. When we get back, I want to talk to you about the Federal Reserve, interest rates, and then get into the idea of pure capitalism. Everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Are you ready to move easily and independently without pain and stiffness holding you back? Do you want to look in the mirror and see a hydrated glow instead of more fine lines and wrinkles? Well, discover Native Path Collagen, made with only type 1 and 3 collagen fibers. These are the two most important types that make up 90% of the collagen found in your cartilage, bones, skin, hair, nails, and gut. They provide maximum benefits, and Native Path Collagen is a single ingredient formula with no fillers, additives, or artificial sweeteners. Plus, it's third-party tested for heavy metals, ensuring purity and safety. Completely flavorless, Native Path Collagen can be added to anything: coffee, smoothies, oatmeal, you name it. It doesn't clump, it absorbs fast thanks to its peptide formula. And the best part, Native Path offers amazing bundle deals at a fraction of the price of other brands. With over 4 million jars sold, 1 million happy customers, 8,000 5-star reviews, and a 365-day no-risk guarantee, Native Path is a brand you could trust. They offer an 800 number for any questions you may have, and then you'll speak to a real person who's there to help. Visit getnativepath.com/PAS and start your transformation today. That's getnativepath.com/PAS. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. So, Richard, what are your thoughts on the Federal Reserve and interest rates? I mean, obviously, we've seen that interest rates have been holding steady. It was interesting that right before the election, the Fed moved to lower interest rates. And now when you see some of the warning signs in the economy, they've kept them flat. So what are your thoughts on the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, well, I think interest rates are at the short-term point for the Fed are artificially too high. And I don't know whether they're keeping them elevated for political reasons or not. It does seem, as you mentioned, when the election was still being decided, before the election, they were lowering rates on the grounds of what? Inflation was still high. I mean, it was coming down, but it was still way above their 2% limit. So that wouldn't be the reason. They were denying that there was any recession. So that couldn't have been the reason either. And so some people started assuming that they was trying to help the incumbent, which was Biden and then Harris. Now that Trump has won, and now that he has this history of bashing the Fed, including Powell, although he did reappoint Powell. People forget that Trump reappointed him. It's argued that that Powell is and the Fed is holding off on cutting rates because of Trump. Let me make a broad point. The fact that this is even questioned as a political thing means we shouldn't have politicized money. I know you know that. I'm a big fan of the gold standard, which means the government does not manipulate money or credit or interest rates for political reasons. They just stay on the gold standard. They just have to keep the dollar as good as gold. But as you know, we haven't had that system since 1971. So we're now on like the 50th, are we at 55th year of off the gold standard. Now, in the beginning, if you remember, Milton Friedman became famous for saying, he wasn't for the gold standard either, but he became famous for saying the Fed is the sole cause of inflation. The Fed should have a rule. The Fed shouldn't increase the money supply, say, more than 2 or 3% a year. So they were, at that point, this is the 70s and 80s, they were still trying to go by some rule. You know what I mean? It wasn't the gold standard rule. It was this money supply growth rule. And after a while, they dropped that and moved to this Keynesian rule, which, if you know, it's called the Phillips curve, where the Fed becomes obsessed about the unemployment rate and the growth rate. And they think inflation is caused not by money, not by what they're actually doing. They think it's caused by the economy. By the economy, you know, sometimes they'll say it's overheating, it's growing too fast, the unemployment rate is too low. These are not reasons for inflation. The inflation is caused by the government overspending and then going to the Fed and asking for the Fed to pay for it, either by printing money or buying bonds. And that's really what's been happening.
But I have to interrupt you because it's always confused me. I'm not an economist. I'm just a lowly political scientist. It's always confused me. Well, the economy is growing too rapidly, so we need to cool it down.
No, that
isn't it a good thing when economies grow rapidly? And don't you want to try and continue to let it grow rapidly? Like, isn't that ideal for everyone?
Yes, it's a total Keynesian theory. It's called the Phillips curve. It's goofy. It's here's their view. When the unemployment rate gets really low and it's hard to hire people, this is the Keynesian talking, then businessmen will bid up wages. And wages are the biggest cost of doing business. And to maintain their profits, they turn around and raise prices. See, that is the logic. And that is built into the Fed policy system. And so they're in this odd position of when the economy is prospering and the unemployment rate is low, they start attacking it with interest rate hikes. And now we're on the other side where, wow, the economy is really weakening, the unemployment rate's starting to go up. And so now it's time to cut rates. See, they're causing fluctuations by manipulating interest rates up and down in ways that are unnecessary. When we were on the gold standard, if you just keep the dollar as good as gold, you're not manipulating interest rates. That's not the main thing you're doing. The main thing you're doing every day, even if you have a central bank, is just maintaining the value of the dollar relative to gold. And you let interest rates go where they will. Well, if you go back and look at where interest rates were under the gold standard, they were low and fairly steady, both short and long rates. They didn't fluctuate all over the place, which itself causes fluctuations in the business cycle. So we're in a bad situation now, I think, because the Fed is the monetary ruler without a rule. It's literally adrift. There's no anchor. I use that metaphor because gold is like an anchor, if you will. And they certainly don't follow the money supply. They allowed the money supply, to boom by multiple amounts.
Oh, it's insane.
They've done it 3 or 4 times, right? They first did it on Y2K. Then they did it on 9/11. Then they did it during the 2008 crisis. Then they did it during COVID. So we're only a quarter century into this century. And on 4 different occasions, the Fed ballooned the money supply, panicking by, whatever those 4 things were, panicking. And that has brought monetary ruin, bringing monetary ruin to the country. But the fundamental underlying problem, I think, is this chronic, I don't know if you want to talk about this or not, but this chronic deficit spending. The government spending is out of control. They know they can't tax people to the full extent of the spending because there'd be a tax revolt. People would literally revolt. Or if they put it only on the rich would just leave. They would just send their capital elsewhere. So I think they're aware of this. And what's the difference? The difference is you'd have to borrow it. You know what I mean? Or print it. So if you don't control the spending, which they don't, even Trump said, I'm not going to touch Social Security, Medicare. Doesn't seem like he's really touching the Pentagon. So the huge spending items are not being touched. But they also can't tax people. So the difference is borrowing. And so there's chronic borrowing. And at the end of the day, the Treasury has to turn to the Fed and say, can you please help us finance this borrowing? Because we can't do it any other way. That is really what's underlyingly ruining the country.
Well, it's a disaster. We're spending $1 trillion a year just on the interest to service our debt. I mean, that's more than the Defense Department receives. And you're right. Nobody has the cojones to touch the big programs that need to be cut in order to get it under control. But we need to take a quick break, and we'll tackle that on the other side of this break, because I think what you're saying is so important. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Are you ready to move easily and independently without pain and stiffness holding you back? Do you want to look in the mirror and see a hydrated glow instead of more fine lines and wrinkles? Well, discover Native Path Collagen, made with only type 1 and 3 collagen fibers. These are the two most important types that make up 90% of the collagen found in your cartilage, bones, skin, hair, nails, and gut. They provide maximum benefits, and Native Path Collagen is a single ingredient formula with no fillers, additives, or artificial sweeteners. Plus, it's third-party tested for heavy metals, ensuring purity and safety. Completely flavorless, Native Path Collagen can be added to anything: coffee, smoothies, oatmeal, you name it. It doesn't clump, it absorbs fast thanks to its peptide formula. And the best part, Native Path offers amazing bundle deals at a fraction of the price of other brands. With over 4 million jars sold, 1 million happy customers, 8,000 5-star reviews, and a 365-day no-risk guarantee, Native Path is a brand you could trust. They offer an 800 number for any questions you may have, and then you'll speak to a real person who's there to help. Visit getnativepath.com/PAS and start your transformation today. That's getnativepath.com/PAS. Welcome back to the PAS Report podcast. Richard, before the break, we were talking about the national debt. You know, it stands at what, $37 trillion, or about to hit $37 trillion. Yeah. Both Republicans and Democrats have increased the debt dramatically. And even though Republicans preach fiscal responsibility, they struggled to get a $9 billion bill cuts passed, the Doge cuts, $9 billion. They struggled to get that bill passed. Right. If we can't find $9 billion out of a budget of $6.8 trillion, how bad is the problem?
That's one way of putting how bad the problem is. I'll tell you one of the reasons I think there's complacency. People don't talk about this anymore, but a couple of years ago, the big word was modern monetary theory. And it was these people who said, with some credibility, it seemed at the time, there's no problem here. There's no inflation. So apparently we can print money without limit and there's no inflation. Then the other thing they would say is, there's no high interest rates here. They're not nearly as high as they were in the Carter years. And so we can borrow without limits, seemingly without penalty, right? You see why they would get away with this for a while? Because for a while, it did seem like we can print money and borrow money without limit. Without limit, meaning without seeming to damage ourselves with higher inflation and higher interest rates. Well, what are people starting to complain about now? Higher inflation, higher interest rates.
And when you have 4% interest rates on trillions upon trillions of dollars, that adds up pretty quickly. And I want to talk, because a lot of the debt has come from these socialist-style programs that we've initiated over the course of the last century, you know, from FDR, LBJ, obviously, exploded it. Even Richard Nixon, you know, he expanded government. When we look at George W. Bush, another Republican, the largest government expansion in the history of the United States took place under his administration with the Department of Homeland Security. But as far as the socialist-style programs, we're seeing the rise of candidates like Mamdani. Obviously, we've had AOC and Jasmine Crockett in play for a while. They're constantly attacking capitalism, saying that capitalism is the problem. Yet, as we've adopted more and more socialist-style policies, well, it seems like the problems that they complain about are the very one they're metastasizing. They're getting worse. Can you answer that?
It's a good question, because we have what's called a mixed system. It's, as you said, it's not pure capitalism. It's not pure socialism either. First, you have to define your terms. Capitalism is basically private ownership and control of property. I mean, sometimes they say the means of production, but I'll just say all property. And socialism is state ownership and control of the means of production. By the way, fascism is a hybrid. But fascism allows you to hold your property.
You just have to do the bidding of the state.
The government tells you what to do with it. So notice that's a hybrid. That's a mix. And now I just wanted to say, sometimes people will say to us, you say we don't have pure capitalism. We've never had pure capitalism. So you guys are talking about, you know, mystical things. I often will say, and I think it's okay to say this, there is a period roughly after the Civil War till World War I. Now it's 50, 60 years or so. That was the purest capitalist system we had. It wasn't anarchy, but there was no income tax. There were no regulatory state. There was peace. The reason I pick after the Civil War is there was a free labor market, so no slavery. And it was the biggest booming period, inventive, all the great technologies that we have even today were invented in that 50, 60-year stretch. So it's possible in modern times to see a system like this. But even in cases like controlled experiments like China, say, versus Hong Kong, or Eastern Europe, East Germany versus West Germany, there's just North Korea versus South. There are so many cases where these are like controlled experiments showing you that capitalism, to the extent it's practiced, really delivers peace and prosperity. Now, here's what I think is happening is when some societal problem occurs, like suppose you say, educational test scores are collapsing, or the cost of living is excessive, or I can't get a job. To the extent they blame capitalism, it's because they don't really know what the system is. And so, and if they lean in any way towards socialism, they're always likely to impugn capitalism. But I liken it to something like, suppose you're a doctor and you ask the patient why they're sick and what their diet is, and it's partly food and partly poison. And you realize, wait a minute, why are you poisoning yourself? Everybody knows the difference between food and poison. And I think the analogy here is capitalism is like food and socialism is like poison. Socialism is like a deadly violation of rights. And capitalism, I think, goes with liberalism in the good sense of being pro-liberty. And if you ever see a problem that really should not be a problem, like declining test scores in schools, it's not due to capitalism. We have government-run schools, and if they were completely government-run schools, then we'd all be illiterate. But you know what I'm saying? That there's many, many cost of living. Okay, the Federal Reserve isn't creating inflation. Cost of living isn't going up because businessmen are greedy, or because labor unions are, gouging on wages. It can be difficult to disentangle cause and effect in a mixed system. But when you know what the basics of each system are, of capitalism and socialism, say separately, you should be able to much better identify what the cause of the problem is. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If instead of people blaming socialism for the ills, they blame capitalism, it's just going to get worse. Because they're gonna say the problems we have is we still have too much freedom, we still have too much profit making, we still have too many rich people, and they're going to continue to impose policies that accentuate the problems.
Well, I mean, it seems like that's exactly what's happening. I mean, your book, Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? You don't hear a lot of people actually going out there defending capitalism, explaining capitalism. Right. And my concern is that, especially for a younger generation, when they see homes that the average cost is about $450,000 and they're still living in their parents' basement. And, the left has full control of the narrative that it's all capitalism's fault. You, as a capitalist, how do you push back against that and try and show your students and others out there that, no, it's not capitalism that's the problem. It's government intervention in our society that's become the problem. It's this regulatory state that has emerged. That's the problem.
Yeah, you have to start with what do you think socialism is and what do you think capitalism is? If they're murky on that, and there are polls, by the way, where they'll ask people, what do you think these systems are? The answers are very bad. So I don't think the academic community, you and I are academics, but we know these distinctions, and you and I know that these distinctions have been blurred. Whether they've been purposely blurred by people who want to blame capitalism, I suspect that's true. But even if we don't question their motives, the only pushback to this is to clarify more particularly. When you see a problem like the schools are producing illiterates, you think to yourself, why would a profit-making capitalist education system do that? They're treating the customers badly. It's only happening because you really don't have a choice about whether you fund these things. They're called public schools. They're called government schools. And just as public ownership of the means of production has proven to be disastrous, we need to, in this country, realize that public ownership of the means of instruction, not production, instruction of the schools, that has to be privatized as well. Because that's a socialist system. But worse than that is a socialist system teaching socialism and blaming capitalism. So it's like a double.
And pushing anti-Americanism, and students have no concept. Do you think that that's a big part of the problem, that students aren't being educated on things like limited government, the Constitution, the idea of capitalism? Do you think that's a big part of the problem?
They're not only not being educated, they're being miseducated. So the difference between I don't know versus what I know and it's totally wrong. Yes, and not just at the university level, but I think it starts with public schools. And by the way, both you mentioned, but one of the things I like about your objectivity is you're willing to say when Republicans or Democrats are both guilty, or when conservatives and liberals are both guilty. Notice that both sides pretty much are okay with public schools. The right and the conservatives will complain that the public schools are corrupted or they're teaching anti-Americanism, but they won't go as deep as defund the public schools and have only private schools. And I don't know why they're reluctant to do that, because we used to have much more of a private school system. There's this feeling that if it was just private schools, that only an elite could afford them. And that's true now. Like if I said I went to a private school, what would you think of me? Richard's rich, right? Because the public schools are taking so much money. But prior to the government getting involved in the schools, people could easily afford decent educations. And frankly, the other thing that happened is people would pick vocational schools or apprenticeships. In other words, they weren't all shunted into or subsidized into going into schools where they don't really need the degree. And I think
and school choice, let's be honest,
yes.
when it comes to things like school choice, because while I agree, I don't like the public school system and I call for its abolishment, I'm also a realist that I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Yeah,
the idea of school choice is
yes,
it actually helps the most vulnerable in society, not the wealthy elite. They could do whatever they want in the first place, but
right.
It helps the most vulnerable.
Right.
But what scares me about the public schools and what I'm seeing is we're starting to see they do much more than just schooling, right? And they don't even educate well, but
right.
They're offering free lunches, free breakfasts, and we're seeing a number of states do this. And it's almost as if there's a subliminal message. Well, you don't rely on your parents for food. You rely on government for food. You don't rely on your parents for your safety and security. You rely on government for that.
Right.
Do you think that's conditioning?
Very much. By the way, you know the problem of child obesity? Nobody connects it to the fact that their meals are taken at public schools and they had the food pyramid for many years. So here you have the agricultural department, a government agency, promoting the food pyramid, which is carbo loading, for decades. And now only recently, in recent decades, have nutritionists said, oh my God, carbo loading really leads to obesity. Yeah, but it wouldn't have that alone was bad, just giving bad advice. But they had it forced on the kids through the public schools. So forget what is being, their minds are being poisoned. Literally, their bellies are being poisoned also by the same government. You know, by choice, though, Nick, I have to point out, I think you know this too, Social Security. Anytime there's an attempt to have private IRA, voluntary means of providing for your retirement, the Social Security advocates try to push it away. And that same thing happens in schools. So
That's why it's became the third rail of politics, Social Security.
So I think you're right that one approach would be, well, in our lifetime, say we can't get rid of public schools. Can we at least have school choice? Or can we at least have saving and pension choice? You know that we've tried these things, and it's very difficult to get them adopted because the advocates of the existing system will say, you're going to drain resources away from us. Yes, that's the whole point. The whole point is to drain resources. And the advantage they'll always have is they're taxing us, right, for the schools. I don't have kids in schools anymore. I'm still being taxed for schools, right? What other product in the market does someone make me pay for and I don't get the product? And same thing with Social Security.
Even worse is the cost versus benefit analysis. I mean, we're spending all this money, and for what? It's not like we're producing Einsteins. I mean, we have to rethink this whole thing.
We're producing voters who then vote away my rights. So not only am I forced to fund these institutions, but they create people who then go and vote away rights. But same thing on Social Security. We can advocate free choice in pensions, and savings accounts and things like that. I think the Trump's trying to do this now. They're called the Trump accounts. And you can do that, but only at the margin because you're still getting taxed with FICA is being taken out, forcibly taken out. And that's always going to beat a voluntary system. I think Milton Friedman in 1962 advocated vouchers. That was 60 years ago, and we still don't have a widespread voucher system for schools of choice. So I don't know. I tend to say, give the radical advice of get rid of all of them. Get rid of the public schools entirely. I know it's not like that happened in our lifetime, but I think these intermediate...
It comes to the bureaucratic class. I mean, they have to sustain themselves. It's about, and I look at it from the Department of Homeland Security perspective. Think about it logically. If we defeat Al-Qaeda and there's no threat of Islamic terrorism anymore, well, you have to find another threat, right? Another threat has to exist. Otherwise, they're going to get their funding cut. And so that's where we saw a lot of the idea of domestic enemies, domestic terrorists, Catholics being labeled, parents being labeled. And unfortunately, that's the case. Richard, always appreciate the conversation. Everyone needs to check out where have all the capitalists gone?
Great.
And you need to keep fighting for capitalism because it is worth fighting for. Thanks so much, Richard.
Will do. Keep up the good work. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.